The weekly Cybercrime and Business Podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to HackSurfer's podcast. Today's date is Friday, December 12th, 2014. Joining us today, we have Eric Severson, Surfwatch Labs data analyst, Jeff Peters, the editor over at HackSurfer, and I'm Matt Lightfuss. I'm a writer for HackSurfer. A little later after the podcast, we have an interview with Greg Schaefer. Schaefer is the president and founder of Schaefer Enterprises Inc, a Manhattan-based insurance agency, and Jeff and Schaefer talk about cyber insurance.
Yeah, so there's obviously a lot going on with cybercrime every week, Matt. I know you got the chance to do some interviews and write some articles this week. Was there anything that stood out to you?
There was an article I posted the other day. I had the opportunity to speak with Phil Gerskovic. Gerskovic's the senior vice president of new growth platforms at Zebra Technologies, and we spoke at length about the Internet of Things, or IoT for short. Zebra Technologies put out a survey, and in the survey with all the participants, they found that 95% of companies were concerned with security and privacy of IoT. However, based off of information they had over the last couple of years, Zebra Technologies also found that even with this growing concern, the amount of companies that utilize IoT, which started out at 30% from their initial findings, has been bumped up to 60%. So it's doubled over the last couple of years. IoT for me is kind of a vague term. So it was nice to get some perspective on what it is. And what do you guys think about Internet of Things? Do you see this being, like a new trend in the future? Because that was Gerskovic kind of felt that. He felt like in the future this was going to be pretty much the new thing, for industry.
Well, I do now and always have and will always hate the name. I'm just waiting for us to come up with someone to come up with something better than Internet of Things, because that's terrible. But it's definitely rising. Just looking over Black Friday ads, I think every single major chain had some smart appliance for sale. Smart coffee makers and smart crock pot, which for something that's supposed to be set and forget is interesting. So it's definitely going to happen. Who makes it better and who makes it useful, not just a fun little perk, it's going to be a big deal.
I know you don't like the term Internet of Things, but I was talking to someone the other day, and they just made the point it's really basically just the internet. When the internet came out, it was basically just connecting different servers, and then it became an internet of people, with all this social media. And now with all the machines being connected, now it's more like Internet of Machines or Internet of Things. So I just kind of view it really as a very broad kind of category.
I'm sure in 5 years, when it's commonplace, we'll just drop the of things, and they'll just be assumed that everything's connected.
Yeah, I guess with, all these devices being connected, there is a few, obviously, privacy concerns with all this data floating around. And I think a while back, there was a survey about basically fridges, being involved in DDoS attacks and smart TVs being involved in botnets and things. Probably the scariest thing to me is really like embedded medical devices. Obviously, if someone's going to DDoS a pacemaker or something like that, that's probably not really that likely to happen, but when you're talking about life or death, it's not something that really comes up that often when you're talking about hacking. So that's always something that's definitely a concern. And I think the biggest thing is just that people, don't know, what's going to happen in 3 years or 5 years or 10 years.
I felt like the most interesting perspective that I got from the interview was our expectations in the future due to the Internet of Things. Like, for instance, I think, if I remember correctly, one of the examples Gerskovic used was eventually you're going to go to every bus stop throughout the United States. And you're just going to expect that there's going to be like a big sign up there that's being updated every second. So you know exactly when the bus is going to be there, how far it is away, where it's going. And I know we have that some places now, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that everywhere you go. So I think in the future, it's just our overall expectations as a society is really going to change because we're going to be so connected to everything. And I thought that was pretty interesting. I thought that was a really good insight from him.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people talk about like the number of sensors. You know, there's going to be so many million or so many billion sensors, you know, by the year 2020. So looking at it from a cybercrime perspective, you know, a lot of those sensors maybe aren't necessarily something that's, you know, going to be hacked or going to be involved too much in cybercrime. But I think definitely just with all the increased amounts of data floating around, there's a lot of opportunity for, you know, whether it's privacy stuff or just kind of everyone always talks about how hackers are really good at social engineering and sort of combining and pulling from all these different things to sort of create a profile of a person. So just with more information out there, you know, like that, I think it's, you know, they can sort of pull all that stuff together to, you know, do some kind of criminal act.
So, Jeff, what else is going on in the HackSurfer community?
This morning, Surfwatch Labs released their November Cybercrime Reports. So I was looking through them and some of the scores, and I guess what stood out to me, there was 4 industries that had increased risk in November compared to the previous 6 months. Government, energy, industrials, and consumer goods all had slightly more risk. But the government sector was actually the worst, got a grade of D. So it had the most increase in risk, is what that letter grade means. So I kind of dove into the data a little bit, just kind of trying to see what was going on, why was the government sector risk increasing. And if you look at Surfwatch Labs data, there's basically 6 scores that they give. They grade the social activity, incident volume, and they grade the cybercrime actors, the targets, the impact, and the practices. And the practice and the targeted assets were both scores that have gone up pretty significantly since the end of October. And they're actually still climbing into December. And looking at some of the tags, I think a lot of that is tied to this region malware that's going around. So for people who don't know, this region malware, Bruce Schneider actually wrote a piece on it a couple days ago. And he said, last week we learned about a striking piece of malware called Region that has been infecting computer networks worldwide since 2008. It's more sophisticated than any known criminal malware, and everyone believes the government is behind it. No country has taken credit, but there's substantial evidence that it was built and operated by the United States. So there's been a lot of discussion about kind of cyber warfare and basically different nation states, you know, building malware and targeting each other. And essentially what this region malware does, it can capture screenshots, monitor keystrokes, steal passwords, recover deleted files. It's pretty sophisticated. It can do a lot of things. I don't know, Eric, do you have any kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, obviously it's difficult in any cybercrime to be really accurate in attribution, but as he pointed out, it's sophisticated, it definitely smacks of government, and then, you know, there's no reason to be surprised that it would be the U.S. The U.S. is definitely involved in these kind of things. There's past things like Stuxnet and Flame that are widely presumed to have come from the U.S. Could probably have some other partners involved. The UK is often involved in these things, and I think you see none of the targeted countries are the Five Eyes, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. When none of them are targeted, it seems kind of apparent that one of them's involved, if not all of them. So I think the most remarkable thing, if it is a U.S. government program, is that it's been going since 2008, and this is the first we're hearing about it. That's more surprising than that it exists to me.
And then another top trending tag was Operation Cleaver, which we touched on a little bit last week on the podcast. I got a chance to chat with Mark Gazit from Federay, and they're based in Israel. So we're going to have his chat on the podcast next week if you're interested in sort of critical infrastructure and cyber warfare and, you know, all those kind of topics. But moving on, Matt, every week you get a chance to look at the data and kind of see what are the top stories that everyone collectively is talking about the most.
It's a real big shocker this week. It's something brand new. Well, I'm kidding. It's Sony Pictures for the third week in a row. By far the top trending target. Everyone's talking about it. Still being discussed. it seems like every day there's a new development with it. Recently, big news, 47,000 people, including actors like Sylvester Stallone, Rebel Wilson, had their Social Security numbers leaked. That's kind of a big deal. Maybe something, I guess it's not funny, but it was interesting. I posted a little snippet on it in HackSurfer, but Barack Obama's name even got thrown around with this because part of the leaked information were from these emails at Sony, and there were some racially insensitive emails where they were kind of, chatting back and forth about Barack Obama. There are also emails and scripts that people are sending back and forth making fun of actors. Like Angelina Jolie, if I can say her name, was called a brat or something like that. So a lot of brand reputation. They're really just being negatively affected. Sony looks really bad right now. We'll wait and see what else is going to happen. We might be talking about this again next week.
Yeah, and that's basically what I read this morning on the Washington Post. Only a small portion of the documents have been revealed or sifted through, and there's up to some reports saying 100 terabytes of information that are now online. So the revelations, could kind of be almost like an NSA kind of thing, where it's just, every week, every month, kind of more things are coming out as people look at it. I don't know if anyone's ever watched Entourage, but I almost kind of got that vibe. It's sort of like behind the scenes, everyone's kind of talking crap about each other and saying all these bad things about different actors. So I think from a brand reputation standpoint, it's kind of hard to really categorize, how much that can cost a company. But obviously, if Angelina Jolie's upset and she doesn't want to do a movie with Sony, that could affect them, for years to come.
And I think it's important to point out, when we talk about data, and when you're going to lose data, this is also the stuff that we talk about. Data. I think a lot of people, when you think data, you're thinking, especially because we talk about retail a lot, you're thinking credit card numbers and number stuff. But this is also data, So if there's any sort of email that you wouldn't want anyone reading, this is what we're talking about with data. So this is the stuff that gets stolen, and this is what can happen. There's more that can happen to you besides having your credit card number stolen and potential fraudulent charges come with it. I think that's important to point out to people.
Yeah, I think as far as the average person front page news kind of reaches, Target has been the cultural touchstone for the last year, but Sony could easily become kind of the watchword, the brand highly associated with cyber attacks, because it's 100 terabytes, it's a huge company, there's a lot of money involved, and you've got all this celebrity gossip thrown in, so it makes it just a perfect storm for your average person reading a lot about this. So it'll be around for a long time.
Was there anything else out there that stood out to you in the top targets, Matt?
Well, it's actually more about what didn't stand out. All year we've been kind of gearing up for this holiday shopping season. We're being warned by all these experts saying, hey, expect to hear about data breaches. Well, we're not. I mean, we have BB, which is, a big breach in itself, but we're not hearing about a lot of retail breaches. It's the holiday shopping season. And the big question I had is, why is that? Why aren't we hearing about anything? Because I think all of us would agree that they're happening. But we're not hearing anything about it.
Well, especially considering the time of year and how big a shopping season this is. I mean, I'm not going to throw out names, but I think a lot of these companies have a vested interest in keeping this quiet, at least in making sure it doesn't come out until after the holiday season if they can possibly avoid it. And maybe they don't know, but they probably have incentive not to look. They sort of benefit from not having their name on the front page, so maybe they'll just stick their head in the sand until December's over and then see what's been happening in the meantime.
Yeah, and from my understanding, talking to different cybersecurity experts, a lot of these businesses basically, kind of lock down their, if you want to call it point-of-sale infrastructure, going into the holiday season. So a lot of hackers hit that deadline of trying to get into the system. And if you're in, they sort of have that same vested interest. I mean, you don't want to start using those stolen credit cards or selling those stolen credit cards and have a company become aware of a breach before, all that holiday shopping is done. So I think from both a retailer and a cyber criminal perspective, we're probably not going to find out too much about different retailer breaches until after the holidays. All right, then moving on to the cyber tip of the week. Matt, do you have one for us?
Sure. This one comes from Phil Gerskovic, the gentleman that I had the opportunity to interview with. And this is about the Internet of Things. And this is a quote directly from him. Entire industries can be completely transformed with these Internet of Things devices. What they really bring together is real-time information of what's really happening in the world to allow existing goods and services to be distributed in new ways, whether it's a rental car, a taxi, or even goods being shipped through the supply chain. By having the real-time information about what is really going on in the world, people's expectations about goods and services are really going to change.
Yeah, and we talked about that briefly, at the top of the podcast about the Internet of Things. Yesterday, we actually had a cloud security webinar at HackSurfer with a few different people, and one of them was Willie Lecter of Cypher Cloud. And we talked a lot about, how that Internet of Things and the cloud is really going to sort of change security. So what he said is, in terms of the cloud and the Internet of Things, it's really a huge disruption in the way that IT works, and IT is fundamentally changing from an enterprise perspective. So I think the big point from that cloud security webinar is that obviously with the Internet of Things, with the cloud, you have all this data sort of out there in the public sort of floating around rather than, behind a perimeter and behind a security wall, kind of like the old mentality. So it's really important for businesses to think about that data and to classify it and organize it correctly so that they know how to add security to that data. And Willie Lecter, he just said that it's really a real shift in mindset that a lot of IT people are, struggling with at the moment. Well, that's it for this week's discussion. Coming up, we have an interview with Greg Schaefer, the president and founder of Schaefer Enterprises, a Manhattan-based insurance agency. If you look at cyber insurance, I guess it's kind of confusing to a lot of people. It's kind of a new field. So maybe could you give us a sort of a brief overview of what cyber insurance is?
Sure. Well, cyber right now is a developing marketplace for us too, as agents and brokers. It's been changing, and I think the news is helping us along quickly over the last few months with Home Depot, Target, and now Sony. It's a policy that's come out to protect intellectual property and people's, I guess, technology assets for a company. And over the past few years, it's been a tougher sell for us as agents, especially when it comes to the smaller and mid-sized companies. A lot of people think that it's a coverage that, it's not going to happen to me. We have a great IT department. We don't really need that. We're following all the protocols. We're PCI compliant. And recently, I think the examples that have been made of these large corporations has made everybody realize that we're all vulnerable, no matter how big we are. And what I've seen is not only have the policies becoming a little bit more robust and covering a lot more, people are becoming educated on it, and people are starting to purchase it more often than they have in the past.
I kind of wanted to ask you about that, just because every article I read is basically, cyber insurance is booming and it's a huge growing market. So, yeah, I was curious, from someone who obviously sells it, if that's what you guys are seeing as well, that it is growing?
It's definitely growing. Unfortunately, what comes with that is the premiums are also increasing because what's happening is it is a newer industry where a lot of the insurance companies and policy language is being tweaked because we don't know how the courts are handling some of these situations. Okay, so a lot of things are still working themselves out. And being vetted by the courts. Also, since the policies are relatively new, policy wording, and they haven't been time tested yet. So as things are popping up, and, look at the Sony malware case, this is, the FBI is saying this is something that happened internationally from North Korea, trying to determine the cause of loss and how the policy language is going to react to these situations and ultimately pay back and reimburse the insured, which is Sony. These are all things that are new to the industry, and they haven't been time tested. So With that being said, the premiums are kind of adjusting themselves now when the companies are seeing what their exposures are, because data that's out there hasn't been time tested, and they need to see where the actuarials are going to start pricing things. And I think that it's adjusting slowly but surely for the near future. I only think it's going to go up. As far as people purchasing it, if you ask me, I'd probably say 1 in 4 people over the last 5 years would purchase a policy. And, it was our job to try and educate them on what the exposures were, and there wasn't a lot of cases out there to help us. Now, with the media and people starting to understand that everybody's vulnerable, even the big guys who have the best ID department, I would say now, 2 out of 4 are purchasing it. And I think that number is going to increase over the next, 12 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm. I guess, when I look at cybercrime, there's just so many different areas in terms of like costs. If you're a breach, there's legal fees, and there's, replacing cards, and, intellectual property and lawsuits. So I guess maybe could you give a sense of like what typical coverage is, like where does a business start and what can they add on and things like that?
Sure. Generally in a cyber and data security policy, you're going to have different components to a policy. For example, and I'm generalizing, each company does things slightly different, and each one has slightly different bells and whistles. But coverage part A would react to more liability. So you have data breach liabilities, you have security breach liability, defense of regulatory proceedings, and PCI fines and penalties. Okay, then you get into coverage part B of a policy, and you can have data breach expenses, okay, and then cyber extortion threat expenses. I guess people always laugh when they see that cyber extortion threat. How's that going to affect me? When the threats now, that people are making, saying we have access to your information, we can hurt you very badly, pay us $1 million, and we will make sure it doesn't happen. Those type of things are becoming more real than they have been in the past. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So it's something we used to kind of say, well, how is that ever going to happen? It's becoming much more real today. I haven't seen personally any of those claims made yet, but I have a feeling that those are going to be, and they might not be spoken about for public relation purposes, but I have a feeling that's going to be an increased exposure. And then you get into coverage part C of a policy where it covers, website liability and then identity theft and things like that. But the most important thing for people to understand is even if any data was not taken and no liability was made on a data breach, the threat is very scary, and the cost to notify your customer base of these possible threats or breaches is very, very costly. So the expenses is something that people should really focus on when they're looking at a policy, and make sure they're identifying the exclusions that the policy might have.
This is kind of good timing in terms of an interview, because I actually got an email last night from a small business owner. They said they were looking to get, cyber insurance, and they didn't really know much about it. And going on Google and things like that, it's just really hard to find information. And then, you're kind of talking about how there's a lot of changes and stuff like that happening. So is that something that you see, that there's just a lot of confusion among business owners around the subject?
Yeah, and it's one of those items that, it's our job to educate the consumer on what coverage is available and what each carrier's strengths and weaknesses are. And then at the end of the day, we have to help them make a decision on, obviously, what fits their budget, what's affordable. You can buy endless amounts of insurance, but unfortunately, you can't always afford endless amounts of insurance. So we try and talk about what are the real exposures to their industry. I'll give you an example that, if you're taking a mom and pop small retail Main Street business that's just swiping credit cards, and their exposure is credit card information and personal data of their customers, or if you take a healthcare facility that has a database that could possibly incur HIPAA violations, in addition to credit card information. That is, obviously if we have a healthcare company, we're gonna focus on who can provide us coverages for HIPAA violations and fines and be sensitive to medical information versus a retail exposure that's just really focused on, credit card data that's going, if someone that's not PCI compliant, something like that.
Yeah, and I guess, the question on everyone's mind is sort of, how much does, this kind of insurance cost? I mean, obviously it varies wildly, depending on if you're a company like Target or a small mom and pop store. But is there any way you can kind of give us a sense of the cost?
It's very difficult to generalize the entire industry for cyber. What I would say is, you have to sit down and take a real look and say, the worst case scenario, what would I be able to incur if we did have a loss? And, could I suffer a $50,000 loss and possibly have a large deductible of $50,000 or self-insured retention up to 50 or 100 and purchase more insurance from that point on? If you can't, if you're a small mom and pop store and you need a deductible of $5,000, so it's going to change depending on where you are in your business. Again, you have to look at what your real exposures are. If you have, if you take a rule of thumb and let's say it costs $150 to notify every one of your customers that you had a data breach and that their information was compromised, how many customers do you have? So you have to start looking at, the numbers yourself and say, wow, this could cost me $100,000 to notify everyone. Am I prepared for this? And could it put me out of business? So I think that's where you have to look to see first what you need. And then as far as pricing goes, again, it's going to be very different between industries and what deductibles you pick. So it's really hard to say. I've seen policies purchased for $5,000 and I've seen some close to 7 figures. So it's a very wide range of premium.
Looking at, say, a small business versus like a large enterprise, is there any really difference like in the policy? I mean, other than the premium and sort of, the amount of money that's covered?
Yeah, it's pretty standard as far as what you're going to see in the policies. What you're going to notice a difference between a large enterprise and a Main Street business is the self-insured retention or deductible, as we call it. A lot of the larger companies will, I'm sure Sony is self-insured for the first $1 million or whatever the number is that, for example, I couldn't or a small business owner couldn't go into a policy with that. So that's the big difference. But as far as the policy structure, you're going to see the same structure from a small business to a large business. However, there are additional endorsements and things like that you can purchase. And I mentioned one of them before, for example, fines for HIPAA violations and healthcare. That those are types of things that you can negotiate when working with underwriters from insurance companies of what type of coverages we're going to need.
Yeah, and obviously, cybercrime affects all, businesses, but I'm curious if there's maybe like a particular, type of business or, industry sector where you guys see more people buying policies?
I would say for my business here, and I'm more of a regional agency where I do the tri-state area. I would say for me, it's more medical. We also have a large focus of business in that sector. So for me, I'm seeing a lot of, urgent cares and healthcare institutions purchasing cyber a little bit more frequently. But what's frustrating is trying to educate everybody to know that everybody's at risk. Anyone that takes credit card information is at risk. I think one of the big, anomalies in my experience with this is a lot of people who take a credit card think that the merchant company is responsible if something happens. And when you swipe your credit card for one of your customers, it's going through your internet connection. It's your responsibility to be PCI compliant. It's not a merchant company's responsibility. And I encourage everybody always to go and review their contract and even contact their rep from the merchant company. And they find out 100% of the time that it is their responsibility ultimately if something was to happen. And that's the number one item we talk about first. Mm-hmm. Where their exposure is. And I find most times people are a little surprised by that.
Say a business owner is listening to this and, they decide they want to look into cyber insurance. I guess where should they start? Because it's something that, pretty much that I guess a lot of insurance places offer, or is it, something more specific that they got to do some research in order to get?
I think the first phone call should be to the current broker that they have who understands their business. And I think that first they could see if there's a current package policy in place, if there's any additional coverages that can be endorsed to that policy to pick up some cyber coverage. That might be the first look. That might be the most cost effective. It will not be the most robust coverage. Anytime you're adding, a little bit of coverage onto an existing policy, it's going to be limited. However, if you want to take it to the next level, I would fill out an application for various carriers. Each application is going to be slightly different questions. I would start with that process. They will need help from their IT department if they're not well versed in the technology world. There's a couple specific questions regarding firewalls, and it gets more technical. But what I would do is fill out as many apps as I can from my broker to go out to certain markets and ask as many questions as possible and get a gut feeling of whether or not their broker or agency can handle this, handle this type of policy effectively. And then once the prices come in and the options are available, always the best way to do is line up what is covered and what is not, and then ultimately decide based on coverage and price that fits their company. But you can't start without an application. That's the number one step.
Yeah, and that's pretty much all the questions I have. Is there anything, maybe you think that we missed that we should touch on?
I think that the big items are, looking at these, what's going on with Sony is one of the craziest cases to me. It's just kind of changing the way things are now with, the threats are completely different every time. We've seen credit card information being compromised for the Target and Home Depot, and now you're seeing a malware breach that really crippled Sony, and everyone's kind of speculating where it's coming from. But it's very hard to detect these things happening internationally, and who knows what the next threat is going to be. But it seems like they're targeting these large corporations, which is frightening to me. And these are people that probably have the best IT departments, or out of most of the companies in the U.S. It's kind of scary that they can get through pretty much anyone they want. So that's pretty much that's it. It's just it's an ever-changing industry. As we speak, it's probably changing in front of us. So it's going to be interesting to see the next 5 years of where this goes.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Greg. Appreciate it.
No problem, Jeff. Thank you.
That's it for this week's Cybercrime and Business Podcast. Please follow us on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you listen, and check out HackSurfer.com and SurfWatchLabs.com for more info.